Okay, I'll begin. So, good afternoon and welcome to our final day of the Slop Conference. Over the last 2 years, Gen AI has seen a remarkable lift with new foundation models by leading companies, open source models, and other apps built on top of these models permeating different spaces in society. So, while AI models and agents bring many advantages, as we've also sort of uncovered over the process of talking about Slop, they have also endowed us with the capability of creating endless streams of serious sounding artifacts, such as proposals, research papers that might not actually have any correlation to the level of expertise or genuine interest of the person using the AI tools to create that. So this is starting to be called the AI slop problem, and it's affecting all parts of society and is likely to also get much worse before it gets better. I'm Diksha, a research associate at Belongg, and Belongg is a social innovation venture focused on inclusion. And Sinceriti is a recently launched blockchain-based proof of intention platform that seeks to center human authenticity and intention in a range of settings such as grant proposal funding, thought leadership, among other spheres. And we've curated the Slop Conference to bring together important discussions around AI Slop. So, what it is, how it has evolved, and how it's playing out in different sectors, and what it's doing to us, and subsequently the path forward. So, over the past 2 days, we've had a really range of really, really exciting sessions with 40 speakers talking about different parts of this puzzle. So, we had a session on the human cost yesterday, we had a session looking at the expertise crisis, a session on hiring. So just multiple different perspectives. And this session in particular will be focusing on the economic and structural incentives that make EI slop profitable, who bears the costs, and what systemic interventions might realign incentives towards authenticity. And I'm really excited about this panel because everybody brings a very different perspective, a very different discipline to this particular problem. And that is where we feel like we'll get really, really great insights. So, the format of the panel will be 10 minutes for intros, where I'll just do a little bit more context setting and also introduce our panelists. Then we would be jumping into 70 minutes for the main body, which is just questioning, and then we'd be leaving 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, I'll go ahead by introducing our very sort of I'll go ahead and introduce the problem, and then I'll talk a lot about our wonderful panelists. So, AI slop is often framed as a content quality problem, that our feeds are getting polluted, authenticity is eroding, and also that this is affecting our ability to think critically. But at the same time, what this framing also tends to skip is the fact that is just the general question of why is slop even being produced at such a scale, right? Because and in the answer lies in something that is also partly economic. Slop exists because it is becoming more profitable. So the cost of producing passable content has collapsed. Um, Platform algorithms specifically designed to maximize engagement do not structurally distinguish between what might come from a space of genuine expertise and AI generated mass production. So the revenue model advertising is also sold against is attention that is garnered towards volume and engagement and not necessarily veracity or originality. So for example, there's a snarf model that comes on to when you're looking at platform engagement that focuses on how you're essentially manufacturing stakes, novelty, anger, retention, and fear. And that is broadly what slop tries to hit, right? But the slop economy also extends beyond content. So there is also a second, less discussed dimension, which means what happens when firms and institutions deploy generative AI to cut costs in their own operations. When a company uses AI to generate market research instead of commissioning any sort of actual field work or engaging with the real life experiences of the people it's affecting, and when the outputs look really polished but maybe really disconnected from the realities that they claim to represent, what does that really mean? And it is often framed as a problem of work slop, which means that it creates an illusion of productivity and analytical depth while substituting pattern match generalizations for genuine understanding. And that can often inform a lot of consequential decisions, as I have outlaid before, right? And at the same time, the costs of this are very unevenly distributed. They fall on creative workers whose markets are being undercut. They fall on people who do data labeling. They also fall on communities whose data actually feeds AI systems. And then at the same time, their interests don't really get represented in their governance. And that is what creates this information environment of declining reliability. So this panel specifically aims to ask who profits from this system and what are the economic and labor incentives that keep it going. So to answer these questions, we have a wonderful set of people. So I would like to first introduce Dr. Sahana. So Dr. Sahana Udupa is a professor of media anthropology at LMU Munich, and she's also the founder of the Center for Digital Dignity. She's a former bilingual journalist in India, and she studies how digital platforms shape political expression, extreme speech, and content moderation. So her books include Making News in Global India, Digital Unsettling, Digital Hate, and WhatsApp in the World. And her AI for Dignity project built collaborative tools for fact checkers, and her shadow politics research has mapped the commercial influence industry behind India's digital disinformation. And she is also a Berkman Klein fellow, and also like and she's a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center, and also a Joan Shorenstein fellow. Welcome, Sahana. So happy to have you here. Next, we have Astha. Astha is the co-founder and director of the Apti Institute, which is a Bangalore-based research organization that looks at the intersection of tech and society. She leads Apti's Data Economy Lab that focuses on building data cooperatives, collective governance, and also the invisible labor behind AI, which also includes a partnership with Karya documenting India's data annotation workforce. Um, Before Apti, Astha's worked at Seva, Dalberg, Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives, and also the Planning Commission of India. She is a visiting fellow at the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University and a member of the WEF Global Future Council on Data Equity. She also leads a 2-year study on women's digital trust in India. Um, and her concept of the big public centers, communities, and not just governments or corporations as agents of digital governance. So excited and looking forward to your insights, Astha. Then we have, lastly, but not the least, we have Akshat, who is a founder and counsel at ASA Chambers, specializing in IP, media, and technology litigation, and he's also a PhD candidate at Cambridge. His Berkeley LLM thesis is on copyright's distortionary effects, and it won Google's Global Award for the most inclusive copyright thesis. And it was also published in the Berkeley Tech Law Journal. His Copyright is the Wrong Answer series argues that copyright itself cannot address Gen AI's labor displacement. And his human enablement theory reframes copyright's purpose as enabling human participation in cultural life. He's also represented A.R. Rahman and advised major tech platforms, and has also been a Wikimedia IIPSJ fellow on race and IP. Welcome, Akshat, and I think we can just jump right into the questions now. So first, sort of beginning the session, we want to map who is actually sort of making money from the slop economy and through what mechanism. So this isn't just a single actor problem, and there's an entire sort of value chain, right? AI model providers, platforms, content farm operators, and like political influence markets, and also firms across sectors that are cutting costs. So we'd love your help in sort of disaggregating this. So first, I would like to turn to Astha. So Apti's work on the data economy, and especially like as I had mentioned, your partnership with Karya focuses on data worker well-being, and you surfaced this broader labor force of data annotators, labelers, and moderators who are essential to making like AI work, but largely are invisible in the value chain. So how do you think about who is actually making profits or is like capturing value in the AI slop supply chain versus who is actually providing the labor that makes it function? And is there something that we're missing in this picture?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, and really appreciate the question as well. Just a quick word on the work that we've been doing is that we started working on data work like all the way back before it was cool, like in 2020, to understand what was happening in India, which was entering the sort of AI supply chain through these low level jobs, which was the sort of entry point that was offered to Indians given our large labor force. And over the years, we have worked on content moderation, we have worked on data annotation, and of which one of the things that we did was Karya. So, Karya is a part of a broader arc. And with Karya, the objective has been to build like a worker charter to see how it can be embedded in other data annotation companies. But just to sort of zone out from the specifics of data labor, um, I think that it is very clear in the context of India that we are, and all of us are emerging from the AI summit just now, so this is a useful conversation to have, is that it is an extractive exercise and it takes multiple forms, right? The first form that it takes is in this labor, which is still, and there are many, many ways to say it, which is that, oh, we are the sort of global warehouse or whatever it is to the AI supply chain, where we are doing these low level tasks. Right now it is moderation, but it is going to grow, or moderation or annotation and other sort of like task-based work. This will expand, as is very clear, into creating multilingual data sets, which are again a repository for extraction, because India's linguistic diversity is what is being pushed out as like, oh, this is going to be amazing for you because we will be able to provide LLMs in languages that make sense for you guys, but we will be we will be again supporting that extraction by creating low resource language repositories. And then the other one is, which again was discussed at length, is safety evaluations as well, which is again like labor to make the models better, right? So if you look at the AI supply chain, we do the grunt work of making data available, and then we also support the value being accrued by improving the models again in these incremental ways, and in the form of labor, but not as participants in that way. And then obviously we interact with the model again as potentially paid users. So the whole supply chain reduces the interaction that we have, and I speak only of India, like with the model in these various frames. The to the Like I said, like the extraction, slop or no slop, is enormous because value is being accrued not by the people who are either doing the work or doing the incremental improvements in the form of safety, etc. On one end, which is like, again, low paying jobs, task based work, poor conditions, and there's enough and more literature that we've generated and that exists in the world about all of this. There's also this sense that the only way that you get value back as a user, so which is the multilinguality thing, which is that, oh, your language will be online and it'll be good for you, and that's one part of it. And similarly with safety, which is like, oh, help us make this better. So there's no ability to negotiate, there's no ability to interact beyond the little roles that have been created for you by the platforms themselves. And similarly, there is no regulatory push on redistribution of value, right? So competition is not addressed. We're not really thinking critically about tax because we're in the innovation hype cycle. So there's no real meaningful thing about redistributing that value. And I think that's where the issue lies in many ways, because uh, payment of wages is not sufficient value creation for the people, or as users is not the. And I mean, these are very much the Manchester goods of, we do the grunt work, we provide the raw materials, they get repackaged and then sold back to us, right? And I think that we've seen this story before, and I don't know why we are allowing it to go as far as we have.
Thank you so much, Astha. I think what you said, especially around, like the fact that, like, the value that is being created is not exactly being redistributed, and also in specific about like safety evaluations, because like we also recently had, like, let's say, the Guardian report that was talking about women data annotators and the kind of safety costs that are associated with like certain types of like labeling harmful content, right? And then the kind of cost that is exacting on people as opposed to the value that they maybe then that they're not even getting, right? Is like that kind of gap is really enormous. So sort of building on that chain of thought and also looking at like the safety evaluation like bit, and also just like zooming out a little bit, I would also love to invite Sahana. So, Dr. Sahana, your work has specifically, especially around like the shadow politics space, has focused on the broader ecosystem where data tested narratives have become like a profitable industry. So, with Gen AI also reducing like production costs, do you see like how do you see this like influence ecosystem shifting? And we would love to see whether you see like new people entering the space, or like what does that really mean for the kind of content that's being produced, especially in like the political sort of space.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you for the question and thanks for the invitation. So, political consultancy is a vastly variegated field. So, it's very hard to get numbers around how big this is, not just in India, in Brazil, and other countries that I've been looking into. So, AI is used in this field for many different activities, and they're also evolving with newer applications entering the marketplace. And these are commercial political consultants. They call themselves politically agnostic, so which is they are all able to offer services to any political client that approaches them. So commercial marketers who craft the respectability of professionalism, they call themselves professional marketeers, and they say that AI is used just as a language tool to clean up talking points or to create graphics, interesting graphics. And one consultant also was telling me that they use AI for creating mock-ups, which is about a particular campaign. It has not happened yet. A consultant gave an example of a protest against gendered harassment, and he wanted to convince the political client that this is a good campaign, and therefore he used AI to show that there are women with broken bangles and stained saris, and these are the kinds of aesthetic forms that they are easily producible with AI, and they use them as mock-ups to convince their client that this is a good campaign to have. So what we notice is there is tremendous pressure among these commercial political consultants to innovate. So clearly, AI enters into these spaces because of the pressure to generate more income. So that, I think, relates to your question about the economic incentives or engaging with these AI-based tools. And there are also other experiments. One politician in Brazil, for instance, had a hybrid human AI as a candidate in the Sao Paulo municipal election. So we are going to see many more use cases, chatbots as AI assistants for election candidates, for voter engagements. So I look into this from the perspective of democracy and from the perspective of political discourses and socio-cultural dynamics. So economy and economic dynamics are part of the analysis, although it is not primarily my focus area. So first, let us just understand that there are these professional strategists, but below this creamy elite of professional consultants who openly discuss about how they use AI, etc., lies a vast stratum of micro and mid-sized commercial players. And some of these are not 100% commercial players, because there are also ideologically motivated players, and there are people who want to just earn a livelihood. So these players, they offer influence enhancement services to different kinds of political actors and also commercial entities. And these entrepreneurs who have been trying and testing a range of election campaign services with the use of digital technologies have also started taking orders for deep fakes and other things. And we saw that there was a use case where the DMK leader Karunanidhi was resurrected through deep fakes in one of the campaigns recently. So 3 trends are emerging. The cost of production is reducing. There are newer platforms like Higgsfield, FreePick, and others. And there are newer players in the field. So these are very young entrepreneurs. Some of them have established their credibility as influencers already on social media. So all these different actors are beginning to use AI to produce content. And now, what happens to content? And I think that's the second part of your question. With these commercial motivations shaping AI slop economy, what happens to content, right? And I would say that content relies on and feeds into social fishes, social fears, and social pleasures. And therefore, I think it would be the same rechurning of long-standing themes. I would even say that it is not about what is authentic, it is about what is affective, what is emotional. So even in terms of the form, I think the outcome is mixed because mal-contextualized memes have been there even before the slop surge happened in our lives. But the exact mix of different forms of technologically manipulated or technologically inflected content is going to change. So there are new narrative forms such as quick burn drama, and there are more audiovisuals that claim to represent real world occurrences. And there are even greater creations that work on aesthetic features of grotesque or hilarity. So I think all these are different types of content that will emerge with commercial political consultancy as a key player in the space.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sahana. I think that definitely, like, I think that also resonates with a lot of what we ended up discussing on the trust panel yesterday, where there was a lot of focus around like looking at like what kind of actors might be coming up in the space of or where the actors might exactly be located. Are they more local actors? Are they more mid-sized actors? Are they more micro actors? And how are they exactly sort of driving like Gen AI slop, and how is that specifically leading into certain political motives? And also I found like your point around like the how just generally how content creation is going to completely change very interesting. And I think it would also be really cool to like bring in Akshat, I think, here. So Akshat, your two-part argument on spicy IP, the copyright is the wrong answer, challenge the assumption that copyright can address the economic displacement caused by generative AI. And we would really love to see like from like a creative work perspective, like where does the value actually migrate to when like AI generated output is displacing creative work, right? And if, for example, Dr. Sahana was also talking about how creation is going to change. So then how does like, let's say, legal architecture have a way to address it, or is it like, is there something that's missing there?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. So I think your question hits on the exact point, right? I mean, in my opinion, and what I've been working on over here as well, is that the whole question of the whole argument or the whole concept of labor theory of value as labor being determinant of value, justifying some sort of a property right, which would in return feed into exchange value out of the value extracted out of labor, would then help one sustain as a functionalist justification for providing some kind of value or commodification essentially of intangible resources. The whole thing is into question now because no more, because the labor theory of value is facing an existential crisis, because as we go forward, AI is going to get trained on AI generated content itself, which would essentially render human labor to the extent of generating value, exchange value, I mean, sort of redundant. And that's where the whole point is, right? The tools that we adopted to ensure that people who are investing as a matter of their life's vocation into communication or creative expression was a tool that concerned with a particular output that could be commodified and used to transact on the market, get some value back, and that value allows you to sustain. And as the commodification sort of evolves over time, the quantum of value increases. But this whole concept of an output being commodified for transacting on the market is now being threatened by the role of the laborer itself being displaced. And that has nothing to do with the particular output. It has more to do with how the mode of sustenance, the labor theory of value that we sort of ascribed for the past many years in justification of a property claim over an expressive output has certain sort of fallacies within itself, because ultimately when this displacement happens, even if a person is able to commodify their expression and able to sort of get some value out of it for training the model, even if the licensing proposals work, you are yet going to get displaced. And so the point is that we need to look elsewhere for understanding the whole concept of value in itself, as against looking at labor as the generator of value in terms of an output that can be commodified and then transacted on the market, right? And that's what I try to get at with my piece, right? Because the whole idea of copyright has always been, and since time immemorial, that is, since its existence, it's not a natural phenomena. It's a particular phenomena historically specific to capitalism, and it wasn't existent prior to that, right? So since its existence, the whole idea of copyright has been justified solely by the concern that people who want to express as a matter of their life's vocation may not be able to do unless we have some policy to be able to enable them, because the goods they are dealing with economically are non-rivalrous in nature. One person's use does not derogate from someone else's use of the same uh, uh, resource, right? And so to make sure that when cost of production is high, cost of reproduction is low, there is a need to have a policy tool to allow them to sustain in a market society. And that tool itself that we adopted was copyright, which essentially concerns with commodifying output of labor and extracting value out of it in quest of sustenance. Now, when the output generated is being displaced not by another output, but by the displacement of the role itself, this whole concept fails essentially. And we currently do not have tools in the bag to address that displacement. And falling back on copyright, which is what is happening around the world right now with some 150 lawsuits, is just a distraction. It's procrastination essentially, right? You're just trying to avoid how to address this large scale issue, which cannot be addressed by a tool that was solely meant for commodifying a particular object, and then sort of using that to sustain the author anyway, which failed even when it was existing, right? So the whole point that I'm trying to bring in with my piece is that we need to get away from that distraction and focus on how to address labor displacement by maybe embedding the market, by having non-market means of support for those who are wanting to express as a matter of their life's vocation, so they're not threatened. Yeah, right. Because we see technologically over time, when GPS technology came in, cartographers who were a specific category under the Copyright Act for protection were completely displaced, and one could do nothing about it. Same happened when printers came, right? Scribes got displaced. One could do nothing about it. But here, when it's large scale cross vocational displacement, I think that's where it's time to not procrastinate and finally find some policy tool in the bag. And only if we step away from property, which is basically commodifying a particular output of production and ascribing the labor theory of value, will we be able to come up with not a non-short-sighted, a long-term solution to this displacement.
Thank you so much, Akshat. I think that really hits on like a very important point, which is just the advent of sort of AI slop sort of makes that distinction very clear, right? Where like the output could be completely divorced from the labor that has exactly gone into it. So in that sense, like using like a labor theory of value to assess the value of that output doesn't really stand. And thank you so much for talking about that, and also just the AI being fed AI generated content, because those are important points that we will pick up on for the rest of this panel. But I would like to move on to like our next segment that focuses a little bit more on the sort of like the platform space and also algorithms on the attention economy now. So now that we know that, like, so for example, like slop content is being produced at mass scale, how do we think that access to quality information is shaped by the attention economy? As we know that platforms in themselves are not just passive carriers, right? Because there's an algorithmic infrastructure. You get recommended content based off of whatever your preferences have been like seen to be, and then content is monetized regardless of what the origins are, right? And what are the inherent tensions between how big tech platforms are set up to operate versus this kind of demand that we're now having for better content quality? And are there cultures of online participation that actively enable like the proliferation of slop, for example? So I would really like to turn to Dr. Sahana for this. So your AI for Dignity project specifically looked at the limitations of like what AI assisted content moderation can do, keeping pace with in terms of keeping pace with extreme speech, and that it must be grounded in a more sort of people-centric way. And given that ethical moderation is something that is also it's going to take a lot of money, do you see a dynamic where responsible platforms might think of this as a disadvantage and may not choose to adopt it later? Or we would also love to know a lot more from your research on smaller media platforms and how they are sort of dealing with the problem of slop, and is it something that they may also encounter?
Thank you. There's a lot in this question, so I'll just address a couple of them. So as we all know, Twitter and Meta have either abandoned or loosened the scruples of content moderation. And content can now be moderated through squabbles and adjustments users do. And this is in the name of community notes, and users can decide what to remove and so on. So although it appears to be in support of giving user autonomy and free speech protection, this is abrogation of responsibility. There is evidence that it is very difficult for different opinions to converge as user consensus. This is what community notes aspires to achieve. And this ultimately leads to harmful content being continued on these platforms and not their removal. So because of these shifts in platform governance, AI-generated videos have found a very fertile ground to reach users on these platforms that have either relaxed or completely abandoned content moderation practices, as we understand. So when companies reach a certain scale of operation and user volume, large platforms is the nomenclature that Digital Services Act uses. So I think we all are quite convinced that they need to carry greater obligations of moderation and risk assessment. They need to invest in content moderation. And the project that you mentioned, Diksha, our AI for Dignity project, we tried to see how far these content moderation practices can go, especially automated solutions. Do they really offer us solutions? And here we saw that there are plenty of problems with content moderation. We proposed a people-centric model, as you also mentioned. We tried to create a dialogue space among fact checkers, ethnographers, and AI developers to bring contextual embodied knowledge into LLM-assisted content detection, right? How do you detect problematic content? And we realized that this is an extremely cumbersome process. In fact, fact checkers from the same country were not in agreement on whether this is dangerous extreme speech, whether it is exclusionary extreme speech, or just derogatory expression, right? So there are always differences among human annotators. But this difficulty cannot be the excuse for abandoning this effort altogether. And that's why we propose this concept of ethical scaling. Ethical scaling is about articulation, because scaling is not about volume, it's about articulation. And ethical scaling means modulating capitalist data hunger and channeling back the benefits of scaling toward protecting marginalized, vulnerable, and historically disadvantaged communities by involving these communities in labeling data, bringing their contextual and embodied language, and also making this annotation process an iterative one through collaborative coding. And now the question is, who has to pay for this? Because label is a huge issue. Is it just because we want to protect platforms that we go and offer our contextual or embodied knowledge? And I think that is where some of these difficult questions appear. And we have said that companies have to take this, although this process is slow, expensive, and exhausting, companies have to invest in responsible content moderation. And then finally, just to sum up that ethical scaling as a normative framework, it means applying brakes to content flows, investing resources for moderation, and also sort of embracing an inevitably messy process of handling diverse and contradictory inputs during annotation and model building, which means that on the corporate side, it requires investments, and on us, and I think including different civil society groups, etc., we need to be attentive to parity, especially global parity, transparency, and responsibility in corporate investment. So that's the kind of collaborative model which also takes into account the question of labor, especially interpretative labor and emotional labor that goes into content moderation. I will leave the question on small platforms because it's a huge question. There are so many different types of small platforms that are experimenting with different kinds of content moderation, but I'll be happy to come to that when the discussion progresses to different angles. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, of course, we can definitely come back to like the smaller, platform question. But I do find what you had talked about around like ethical scaling really interesting because I think that like I mean, I think it becomes really important to also sort of like as you said, not use the cost as or not use the investment in and of itself as something that's an excuse that like, oh, I have to invest in human labor, I have to invest in this to make this platform safer, shouldn't just be an excuse to just like cop out of the fact that you're not doing it at all. And so here I would also like to perhaps pivot to Astha. So Astha, since you have also worked a lot on like data stewardship and also like platform governance across like multiple angles. So we wanted to like ask like where do you sort of see the most effective lever for being able to like have some sort of governance over like this output or like governance over the business model, and yeah, also like generally, yeah, in terms of platform accountability.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we're learning about the way that governance is happening in the world right now is that there's this general sense like, oh, we're in the deregulation era, but actually we're not. Like, it's just changed forms in terms of uh, in terms of the modalities of governance are not what we have traditionally understood, like rules and laws and frameworks. But as we've learned from the Anthropic thing, it just can be brute force governance or industrial policy and things like that, right? So the form of governance from the top is changing, and therefore I believe that there should be a broader way for us to think about governance as well. And that is part of the work that we've been doing at Apti Institute, which is that looking at where do communities become the stewards of their data, or at least the decisions around their data. This is not about ownership, this is about agency, which is how do we create the socio-political infrastructure to do that. So to give you an example, one of the areas or ideas that we work on and are very bullish on is the idea of data cooperatives, which is that cooperatives exist, 1 out of 10 people globally is a member of a co-op. And they already do a lot of the co-governing, which is like one member, one vote. They do things like pooling of resources, whether it's labor or capital. So how do you apply that to data? And there have been bits which are of interest. Karen Howe's book also talks about smaller models and how you can have communities build things that go from where meeting community need to creating models that can be eyeballed in a small instance by communities. And this is not new. Like, we've seen this kind of shared stewardship across different kinds of moments. But there is a malicious intentionality in the way that the AI governance discourse is framed, which is like, it's too high level, it's too big for ordinary people to meaningfully govern, and it can only be done through those top down frameworks of whether it's copyright or whether it's competition or whether it's some other data protection, right? And what we've seen, and even what Akshat was saying, is like there needs to be a rethinking of that governance in some ways, which is to make it much more as a push to tussle for some of that power. And we've seen also, like, I mean, in the context of what Sahana was saying in terms of information, right? Like, we know that in a country like India, there is a lot of offline intermediation that is required to make sure that the information that is being received, even from government applications or portals, is verified by a trusted frontline worker, whether it's an ASHA or an Anganwadi and things like that. But what we are pushing for is like, oh, there's going to be, this is an inefficient way and we can just make the technology better, right? But offline intermediation is a feature. It is an important part of how people consume information, how they verify the truth. And that is part of the governance that we need to think of. What kinds of existing social, political, emotional structures are required to create that sort of pocket of governance that doesn't happen at that highest level, but happens in a space that can be eyeballed. Again, an example from our work is that when, in the context of, say, fraud, which is a completely ungovernable problem, as we've realized in the last few years, is that we don't know, we know that women who use applications in community settings are less likely to make mistakes than women who are doing them by themselves. So there are obviously checks and balances within communities that are governing behaviors, that are governing interactions with technology, but are not treated as governance. They're just treated as things people do, and and are also sometimes viewed as frictions to adoption, but those are necessary, and those are the types of governance that we need to think about in a time where top-down governance in the rules-based ecosystem has actually been letting us down.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that really helps tie a lot of this together, like our broader I think even from what Sahana was talking about in terms of contextual knowledge and people talking about their own lived experiences and how that sort of can come into content moderation, to your point to talking about what a bottom up approach rather than just a top down process can look like, and also how do we sort of focus on essentially surfacing human agency within these spaces. So something that I also wanted to perhaps ask, and this is an open question to whoever wants to answer this, is I think when we're also looking at slop, it's also a problem of a degraded information environment, right? So then who do we think is bearing the most ultimate, who are the people who we think are bearing the most ultimate cost of dealing with a degraded information environment that may not necessarily get covered in the space around platform accountability?
I'll go.
Yeah.
So I have conflicting views on this, in my head, because I can't grasp as to how to resolve this confusion within my own self. But it's like, obviously the cost is to humans because culture is the source of the self, and this is all content, which is essentially expression, communication. So it hits right back at you. But then, I'm also of the opinion that what one may call degraded content may not be degraded for someone else, and that's the subjectivity of content itself, right? There was this book called Remix by Lawrence Lessig, I remember, where he spoke about this in the context of amateur creativity, where the focus was that there are a lot of creative outputs which may to one seem amateur, but to the other be a source of democratic engagement. And so that's where my conflict in my head lies, right? Because as patterned creativity comes in, we are moving a step away from disruptive creativity, means basically disruptive idea, disruptive thinking. And that is a source of a lot of concern as against anything else, right? As against the content itself, the lack of the existence of unpatterned, disruptive, creative indulgence or engagement or ideas, which could be a reasonably proximate outcome of AI slop or degraded sort of, I mean, not degraded, but patterned creativity, would essentially be a harm or a cost to human society in terms of, because ultimately that's what constitutes oneself, right? That's what shapes one's own self, what they social in the social relations of communication, what they're exposed to, and what they expose others to constitutes their own self as well as contributes to the constitution of everyone else, right? So that's where the conflict in my head lies, at least.
I think I'll quickly jump into this ambivalence that Akshat has very well brought out. So when we look at the quality of content that's produced, could we have a very clear binary between degraded content and authentic content, which is supposed to be acceptable? I would say that slop is not the opposite of authenticity. Slop versus authenticity is a false binary. There is no need to import moral panics about authenticity from elsewhere. I say this because, also, as Akshat mentioned, some of these cultural creations have always been a messy terrain of different kinds of appeals, right? The original imitation binary has been there for a very long time, and so is the distinction between grotesque and pleasant. And there again, there is the subjective assessment of what is pleasant and what is grotesque. And these contestations have been part of our social fabric for a very long time. And just if you look at fakes, for instance, there are also satirical fakes that speak against power. So I think that is the complex social field that we need to take into account. And once we take that social field as our object of inquiry and not a particular piece and its intrinsic value, then I think we will be able to draw conclusions on who is using slop, how is it being produced, how is it being organized, especially in terms of distribution, because I think that angle is very important. That's why shadow politics is talking about how these materials are made to reach certain segments of population at certain points in time in a very crafted way. And I think that angle becomes more important than what we deem as the intrinsic value or even meaning inherent in these creations. I would therefore think that we need to go beyond content-focused research and look into content in context. How does it get circulated? Who produces them? Who invests in them? And for what purposes?
Also to add to that, I think, we're sitting on the morning of OpenAI raising another, enormous, I think the biggest funding round ever, and also a little bit to Nirat's question in the chat. I think we have to also bear in mind that the value is circulated between 8 companies. Whatever 30 billion that is given by NVIDIA is to be spent on GPUs. Whatever 40 billions given by Amazon is to be spent on AWS. So, we also know that this is extremely circular in the way that the money moves as well. And so, only 5% of ChatGPT users are paid users, right? So I think that there is something to be said about the business model as well, which is not clear. This is a bubble, as that is clear. The askance of the banks to spot the debt, all of these things are and OpenAI is supposed to spend $9 billion this year, and they're nowhere near in that revenue, but are valued at 790 billion. Like, none of these numbers make sense, and therefore I think that we have to also be mindful of the value we are sold, that these are indeed extremely valuable companies. But I think that as we get closer to that analysis of, is this money really true? Does this exist, or is it complete hogwash? And I think we are inching towards that, is clear, right? Like, and I think that we also have to be mindful of the hyperbole of the hyperscalers in that way, because I think and this is not to walk away from the necessary, like, bottom up tussle, regulatory pushback, etc., that is necessary, but it is also important to see it in the context of the fact that this is also a bubble, what like and I think that a bubble without responsibility, which is the scary part of all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for everybody's interaction. I think this really brought out some really important points around, like, for example, what Akshat had talked about, patterned versus like unpatterned creativity, and also Dr. Sahana's point around like looking at content, but like for example the conversation around all of this shouldn't just be limited to content. It should also bring in context. And then like I think I really also resonated with Asta, how you were also talking a lot more about bringing this in context of, like, for example, like the open AI investments, also how it's just like looking more and more like a bubble, and where what is exactly sort of looking at the business model in and of itself. So I think something that I also wanted to perhaps pivot to, and since we were also like we're now inching towards this like conversation around like looking at it as like beyond content. So something that we also wanted to perhaps touch upon is, like, let's say we have like AI generated like outputs, AI generated slop that sort of looks like productivity. So there's like the concept of like work slop, right, which is like things that look productive on the surface, but then are AI generated outputs that may not necessarily actually make sense. And then like essentially they're very like sort of when these outputs tend to inform like really high stakes decisions that are also divorced from lived realities, especially when you're looking at let's say governance firms, when you're looking at institutions, and when there's like so much of a pressure to like constantly keep optimizing, right, like we need to create things that are low cost and high reward. So how disconnected do you think AI generated organizational outputs can be from the ground, and what do you think are like long-term implications that we might be missing? So like so I would really like to bring, like, for example, like Asta, since you were just talking about this, I think asking you about this would also be a good idea, because you were just talking about the value creation and also just like how it's like specifically within three companies, right?
Yeah.
So we would love to like specifically ask, when firms like replace the kind of embedded expertise with like AI generated analyses, what would that gap look like in practice, also from your work with healthcare, finance, and like the gig economy?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, again, just because the last couple of days have been as they have, I think that we definitely have this sense, and like there was recently a study which is like the US invested so many, I think $30 billion in getting computers in every classroom in the States, and then the cognitive oh, like abilities of this generation are lower for the first time than the previous generation. So there is a very real, and I mean there are studies and studies on like how the consumption of this kind of information is making us stupider. And so there is a huge cognitive decline that I think we as as a people have to reckon with. I always say that if like the builders of these technologies are educating their children offline in the jungles, etc., then there's something that they know that we don't. And so that there's that part of it, which is the impact is deeply cognitive, using slop, or investing in technologies that we don't fully understand. And I guess like we are now at that point where the graduating class of 2024, 5, 6, like, are the people who have been the first people who are like fully online, right? So that's one part. The second part, obviously, is I think a huge thing is trust. I don't think we spend enough time thinking about what trust does as somebody who runs an organization that is whose reason to exist is building knowledge. Like we have now found ourselves like constantly in this position where we are checking the work of like there's that productivity performance obviously, but then there's also a complete debasement of trust, which is that because the technology is as good as it is, it's impossible to tell. And I was just hearing from like a journalist who was saying that like they've received 100 op-eds after the AI summit, and they're all slop, right? So they're figuring out how to test it, how to make sure. So and then I think and the trust relates to also like how it's not just at the institutional level but at the societal level, which is like we've always had, like I was saying, mechanisms, good or bad, to check the source of information, to check for ourselves. And I think both, and it's two parts, right? There's the immersion of technology, and which is being wrapped in to government function, for instance, or social media function, or to what Akshat was saying, like synthetic data is going to train new data and those kinds of things. And then the other part of it is that all the interpersonal humanness part of it is also receding, right? So I think that in that context, trust becomes like an entirely big thing. And I think that this is because we studied trust for 2 years. It is really is the difference between benefit and harm. It is the difference between gullibility and adoption, right? Like healthy adoption. And I don't think we give enough texture to that, because again, it seems like a complex thing to do. And then finally, I'd like to say, I mean, because there's so much that is being done about safety, and I think that just that part of it, because also safety is being commodified by platforms as well, as we've seen again, like in the last couple of days. I think there is more to noodle around on that. I don't think that there is a sufficiency of examining safety just on platform, which is easy to do in some ways, but then in societies like India, where we have seen enormous repercussions due to poor news, like we're beyond misinfo, disinfo. I think things have evolved, and I think that that's again like a big part of what we don't fully understand as an impact of slop or the integration of these technologies into our everyday lives.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Asta. I think that again, like this really ties into like what we had also been talking about on our panel on trust, which was like a lot. The larger focus of that was also sort of to look at the impacts on democracy and what it's having on like impacts on interpersonal trust, and sometimes how like it can even act as like an engine of mistrust, right? And that's something that, yeah. So I think that was also coming up, and I would also perhaps like to bring Akshat in, because Akshat, you have specifically like looked at like so since you have like a background in law, we also wanted to ask like if a firm, let's say, relies on like AI generated analysis that turns out to be flawed, then who would you, let's say, ascribe responsibility to? And like beyond that individual case, like since we'd also been talking a lot about like labor displacement, like when organizations might like substitute AI for domain experts, like is there a broader sort of devaluation of expertise that you see happening? And is there also, like to Astha's point, a devaluation in trust that you're also seeing in your domain?
So just before I get into that, I find it very interesting what Astha said right now, especially because uh, all over time, and because we were speaking about copyright, all over time, the concept of an output generated by labor was justified by some theory of the intrinsic motivation, and driving some kind of incentives towards the people who have this intrinsic motivation to contribute, to express, right? Now, just the what AI is doing best for me is questioning our lived social realities. Like, for instance, this whole interesting intrinsic motivation thing to do something is being directly questioned over here because of the amount of slop that we see, right? And it's all a circular idea of how cognition is actually going for a toss, because there is no motivation to have cognitive output there, which is also a reason as to how we'll see disruptive creativity sort of go away. Coming back to your question, so personally, see, I run a firm. I also have an issue with, in a sense, I'm also encountering a lot of issues with AI generated content being used by my colleagues who are working for me. And overall, it does create a huge trust issue where you just cannot trust an output. But at the same time, using AI generated output is also efficient if you know how to use it well, but that requires a certain level of cognitive sort of readiness that has to be there prior. So displacing your cognitive skill with AI generated content is where the problem lies. And insofar as responsibility is concerned, see, in a profession like law, uh, there is huge professional responsibility, not just towards the court, but towards the client. And so there's a huge embodiment of trust that is involved. And out there, out there, it's quite clear that the liability will always fall upon the lawyer. And we've seen fake citations being made into in courtrooms. We've seen all of that happen very frequently, especially in the last 2 or 3 months, right? The Supreme Court commenting on fake citations being there in the brief. I don't per se think that drafting using AI, like for example, drafting legal briefs using AI is the problem. I think the problem is doing it in a sloppy manner, in the sense of just replacing your cognitive skill with that, because that undermines the duty one has, in terms of the professional duty one has towards both the client and the court. But more than that, I think where your question hits on very perfectly is the idea that here lawyers need to, and in a professional setup, again, lawyers are relying increasingly on AI, to the extent that disruptive argumentation, which would not come out of patterned creativity, is losing some kind of force, right? You're not able to, I see many arguments being repeated, and that's where, there are things, these are things which will exasperate over time, because of the discussion that we had on pattern versus disruptive creativity. So yeah, that's the real concern, I think, surrounding. But per se, AI usage, at least in the legal profession, in my experience, is not really bad.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think a lot of what you said is like really interesting in terms of like who bears like responsibility, right? Like where does the liability fall if in case like you're using AI generated content and it turns out to be inaccurate, and like the kind of responsibilities that people have. And I think I would also like to bring Dr. Sahana in to perhaps talk about this, since like your experience, since your book has specifically looked at like, let's say, making news in global India, right? And it focuses a lot on how Indian newsrooms adopt like specific types of language that may actually conflict deeply with like the lived realities of people on ground. We I've also wanted to perhaps like pose this to you, because in a lot of cases, let's say, journalists also have this responsibility to like bear truth to the public, right? And that's something that we also heard in our like portrait session from like Osama and Kavita, who were talking about it. So do you think that this also like the kind of AI slop or the AI generatedness of things is also sort of resonating with patterns you're observing in your work, in like media, or in your work like looking at like how like how media is functioning right now?
Yeah, thank you. Let me take this question in regard to political consultancy that I'm closely looking at in recent past. And I'm so glad that you have drawn parallels between my earlier work and current predicament between, or rather the division between authenticity and inauthentic content. But in the political consultancy space that I've been looking into, we see that there are trends to see technology as a shortcut, right? Automation to save costs. And this is not a new thing, of course. Platforms also use automation to save costs. Content moderation, for instance, is an extremely expensive endeavor if human annotators are involved. So they've always looked to automated solutions to cut costs. And similarly, we see that AI is now being used to cut costs for political consultants as well. And that's also a sort of contradiction, because on the one hand, automation and technology is supposed to generate demand and value. And on the other hand, technology is also a shortcut. So those are some of the contradictions we see in the technology discourse itself. But I'll give you one example. I was talking to a political consultant, and he said they now have a fantastic AI model to make predictions about voters' sentiments and decisions, right? And these aspirations to crack this so-called holy grail of how voters will ultimately vote in a particular election has been there for a long time. But now I think AI models are giving them a sort of technological language to claim that they finally hit it, they finally nailed it. And here, I think what we see is the reductionism of voting as a social activity. And according to their model, they are able to very clearly distinguish who is going to vote for this party and who is not going to vote for this party, and they have a predictive score between 0 and 1. It's that precise, right? And that's the kind of a slop of reducing social complexity to predictable models. I think the bigger question is what happens when these products enter political spaces and social spaces. I think these are bigger questions, and our other panelists have also very well documented this in different spheres of activities. And clearly in political consultancy, we see these different activities that might actually undermine the process of democracy. I will close with a very brief comment on Neeraj's question about where is the actual profit, whether it's the frontier model or AI slop, etc. But we need to just also probably remember that frontier models are coming from companies which have a huge infrastructural advantage. Especially big tech, I think they not only give out frontier models, but they are also drawing all these different players into lock-in dependencies. And that, I think, is the reality that we need to keep in mind. It's not just about a particular AI model, but it's the whole infrastructure of different kinds of services, including cloud infrastructure. So there, I think some of these debates about who profits from this will be clearer if we take the bigger picture.
Thank you for that, Sahana. I really liked for example, like we sort of like traced a journey through your answer where you were talking a lot more about like how sort of social complexities can get reduced to AI models, and then we also sort of then were looking at more like what the bigger picture then looks like, right? And I think that also gives like a really good segue into like sort of like the next segment of what I wanted to talk about, which is like and this is something that we've sort of been touching on in parts over the course of this conversation, which is that like there's like this gold rush of AI investment happening, right? Where everybody is sort of investing in AI companies. Everybody's like, oh my God, AI is great. And what happens when models are consistently sort of fed low quality AI generated content than original human output? So for example, like there is a very real sort of documentation of the concept of model collapse, right? Like that if you keep feeding synthetic content to AI generated models, like the model will eventually collapse because it's being fed low quality training data. So is there a point which the promise returns from like these technologies have already started to deteriorate? And does the slop economy by flooding the training data pipeline also undermine the very technology that it depends on? So is it like a sort of Ouroboros situation where it's like a snake eating its own tail? So we wanted to also like, I think it would be really great if we could like perhaps like bring Astha in for this. So like if training data quality, for example, is degrading, like what does that mean for AI systems, especially when they're going in like consequential domains such as health, finance, welfare, where APTI has also been tracking impacts? And is there like any sort of governance framework around it, or is it just like a big like gap that we're seeing right now?
Oh, it's a huge gap, and one that I think that the governments also haven't necessarily considered. Um, I think that, I mean, again, like I said, like for me, the short answer is that these cannot be the only source of truth, and we have to make sure that the offline architectures around these technologies remain robust and well funded, so that they are able to, create the necessary information, fact checking, resilience that emerges, and there should also be, I think, the question of where are these technologies necessary. We're still in a position where we can roll some of this back. Like if we decide that this is maybe okay for telemedicine but not okay for insurance, which I think should be the case, like how do we make sure that we are able to create necessary guardrails, and I don't like that word at all, but like necessary blocks for the use of this technology. So I do believe in red lines. I mean, the EU AI Act, which has been since watered down, had red lines about where you can and cannot use AI. I think we also definitely need some clarity and transparency. I mean, like, how many people know that your ability to get a credit card, for instance, and I'm not even talking about LLMs, I'm talking about, earlier versions of algorithmic matching, like, are done via algorithmic systems, right? And that there is no way to get recourse, grievance, or any kind of mechanism of asking the question. And now, and if you just apply that to, social entitlements, you apply that to insurance, you apply that to jobs, the harms are going to be so much more, that there needs to be, and not just like transparency, but I think negotiation is what I would like feel like we need to aim for.
Yeah, I think definitely resonated with what you said around like guardrails and the need for like red lines. And I think that's also something that we've been like sort of like this is like a sentiment that I think we've also been hearing from like others about. What I also yeah, sorry,
Sorry,
Asa,
just
did
to
you have
add, I think like since we are talking about slop and use of AI around like communication, I think one of the major red lines which we've suddenly seen emerge in the last few weeks is like, AI generated videos being used to demonstrate situations that we don't have full details on. And I think that's extremely dangerous in a low sort of resource country like India. And so to me, like having different layers of like where it's just not possible, like news channels must not use AI generated videos for XYZ, right? Like that's a very easy thing to make possible. And I think that's what we've also seen in the context of media, like in written word, right? So I think that each industry will have to think about what its red lines are, and enforce them quite stringently.
Yeah. I think definitely, I think that brings up a lot of like I think what you said also around like let's say AI generated content being platformed on like news media. It's also like I think it's also so much about like where is that AI generated content like receiving like social sanction, and where is it also going into spaces of or institutions where there is like huge influence, right? And that influence also then sets the norm for like further behavior or participation around like what is the use of these outputs, or like how credible or how legitimate they seem. Something that I also wanted to perhaps like bring like Dr. Sahana in for was also um like your research on like specifically like disinformation. I think we were like touching a little bit upon this in like your previous answers as well. But like, do you also like see a parallel in like the AI content ecosystem where let's say AI generated content gets recycled as like training data, which may then like remove the system away from like grounded human knowledge and like what is extreme speech, because we'd already talked about the limitations of these systems. So then like if and we also know that notoriously let's say AI is bad at labeling other AI generated output. So like what are you seeing specifically?
I think this will be a problem, especially when companies use synthetic data to train models. But they will continue their hunt for real world data. I think they will continue that chase. But I will take that question slightly differently, because I think we are running out of time. We just have another 15 minutes. So I understand that this kind of content can really bring down the value of political discourse. We don't have to really panic. We should not adopt a hyped discourse, but we are clearly seeing certain areas where AI slop or AI generated content more broadly can cause trouble. And some of these issues can be very serious. For instance, recent studies have shown that the Russian disinformation mechanism, it utilizes AI to reach users by posing themselves as ordinary citizens, not any star influencer, but AI characters who appear to be discussing real world politics as ordinary citizens, right? And these are some of the new challenges that are coming when AI creations revamp distribution by appealing or appearing to be ordinary. That's just one of the use cases in this space, which is concerning. And as regards regulation, I think we'll have to get to this serious question. What we should be concerned is not merely the existence of slop or not, but the exact kind of slop that's entering these fields. And here, I think we'll have to pay attention to how real world content or content that's generated by real world people and also AI generated content are feeding into exclusionary agendas. It could be gendered harassment by using AI to strip women, the recent Grok controversy to turn women into different kinds of images, including naked images, and to attack, of course, LGBTQI plus communities, or instrumentalizing these creations for misleading political narratives. I think this is where the real implications of AI-generated content lie. And we need to have different kinds of guardrails, although that's not a favorite word for Astha. So clearly, whatever we want to call, definitely regulation that can bring down all these different factors, whether for model makers, of course, they can do a whole lot of things in the form of system prompts or constitutional AI. They can bring more accountability and transparency in terms of how they label and source training data. And for platforms, labeling is the bare minimum responsibility, but it has to go beyond that. And the third policy angle is about these sundry actors, right? Dispersed actors, and what Neeraj calls downstream applications, etc. So these are really emerging fields where accessible image generators are being used to produce all manner of content. So a third regulatory intervention should be around these actors, and how do we implement ethics of AI use? Because for them, these ethics are nebulous, negotiable, or simply untranslatable into action. They're trying to earn a livelihood out of these. So that is another field that we'll have to pay close attention to, these dispersed networks of influence peddlers, what I call shadow politics.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Sahana. I think that was really I think that really touched at like the core of the problem, which is like also just like how do we even like what would policy responses or what would governance responses and regulatory responses even look like? And I think that also sort of like then like putting it in the context of the entire panel like, discussion that we're having right now is also just around what is like the way forward, right? So I think I'm gonna now pivot a little bit into like our last sort of set of questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. So the last question that I have is just like the sort of macro question, right? Like because we've been talking a lot around like let's say restricting Gen AI use in certain spaces, Gen AI generated news without disclosure, and also like what would regulations around that look like? And also just broadly, like we're also now like in the context of the fact that now OpenAI is now considering like bringing ads, testing ads in 2026. Google is also now bringing ads to Gemini. Like AI tools that were supposed to be different from social media are now focusing more on advertising, which then goes back to our conversation around the attention economy. So, like, what is the case for like restrictions on AI and when AI intermediaries adopt like similar revenue like models as like the platforms that they want to replace, are we just like recreating the problem? So, I would really like to bring Akshat in for this. So, Akshat, you've looked at like both like IP, media, and tech. So when like conversational AI might embed like a sponsored recommendation in like a what is considered like a trusted answer, is there anything in like advertising or consumer protection law that might extend to that? And looking at India's current like sort of set of regulations, what do you think would be a good or appropriate regulatory response?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think there's a legal concern with advertisements being allowed on these platforms. Of course, they will then be governed by the regulatory regime concerning advertisements, which is under the Consumer Protection Act, and then there's an ASCII self-regulating code which all these companies sort of adopt, where they sort of try to have a code of ethics and practices. So then what kind of, I think the concern will actually be as to, I mean, there will be issues that will go into litigation, for example, where at what point and what context and what output is the ad being shown, and at what place the placement of the ad, as well as the frequency of the advertisement, all of which will contribute to some sort of litigation, because that's, you cannot predict what a user is going to ask the model, and basis which the model will respond a particular way. And at that point of time, the placement of the advertisement, if it is uh, at a particular query, the developer of the model cannot imagine the kind of queries that may come in, right? So the placement of the ad would create a lot of issues. I remember when I was working with an IP firm, previous to my current firm, I used to sort of do opinions concerning comparative advertisement claims by AI generated. Like basically something like, for example, imagine the output of an AI model sort of disparages the product of another company as against one company, right? So, for example, Amazon has Rufus. Rufus is their live shopping assistant. Like if you ask Rufus about a particular product, and Rufus says X is better than Y, and imagine if Rufus is paid to say that by X, that will create a big problem in law for the model, because where the source of funding will be a little will have to be more transparent for the model's responses, so that the responses, it's like, it's like when you write a blog post on a blog, there is a requirement for disclosure of funding, so that your position is verified as not being influenced by where you're getting funded from. Similarly, in the AI context, where the advertisements are sourced, and who is the one that is involved in or being able to advertise on the platform, will definitely determine and if it has an impact on the content that is being produced by the model at the output side, then that will be a big problem in terms of how to navigate that. But currently, there is no regulatory regime that is present in India, and the best way going forward to resolve this issue would be to have a very sort of clearly defined regulatory regime concerning both consumer protection, concerning transparency requirements in terms of the funding of the firm, especially in the jurisdiction that they are operating, and yeah, disclosure if ads are also related to the sources of the funds.
Right, thank you so much for that answer. I think I would also like to then perhaps bring Astha in for this. So Astha, what do you think is the balance between harmful uses and redesigning incentives altogether? Because I think we've talked I think from from the very beginning we've been talking a lot about data stewardship and also cooperatives and what would just centering agency look like. So just responses on that.
Yeah, I think that again it's a tough one because I feel like we have to think a little bit more about harms in a more expansive way. I think that the way that it's currently framed is insufficient. And I think that so on harms, I would push to doing much more like in society evidence and evaluation and not just on platforms. And then on, I think the value question, to me, some of the instruments that we have at hand are things like taxation, and we have to think much more about what the role or how do we make sure that we sneak some of these requirements that we have of applications at the point of procurement, right? So we do have non-regulatory instruments that we can deploy to ensure that distribution of value. And I think more about, as I mentioned, like the limitations that we need to do, which again I think would be a very necessary way of moving forward on this on the use of this technology.
All right. And then I think finally we would love to hear from Dr. Sahana as well. Just any closing comments on what do you think co-regulatory models could look like, and also just what would, if there were restrictions, what would should restrictions look like? I mean, further from what you've already sort of elaboratively mentioned, is there anything that you feel like you want to add?
Thank you so much. I think I will add a broader point, which is again repetitive, to emphasize how it has to be holistic, because there are very many stakeholders here. There are users, there are platforms, there are communities, which is very different from individual users, and there is the political class. And I would say that international regulations, international conventions are very important, because AI is a planetary problem. It is not really limited to any particular country. And some of these regulatory calls might appear a bit utopian or very ambitious given the state of things. We are now witnessing many different developments that are very sobering. So all I can say is UN and other bodies should continue to use its convening power to create a dialogue for responsible AI use. And within different countries, we need to have a layered approach to address different actors, including downstream application developers and different kinds of actors that are engaging with AI from the margins, from the sidelines, etc. So a holistic approach and an international convention approach would be very important.
All right. So thank you so much for everybody with their really, really comprehensive and thoughtful responses to this. I am closing the questions for this, but I do think we have some questions in the chat and we do have some time to perhaps answer. So if anybody would like to, I think the first few questions that I think Nirath had answered did get covered, but Astha, Akshat, any quick responses to the specific questions that are mentioned to you in the chat? Or Nirath, in case you'd want to ask them, please feel free to.
Yeah, I think just a very quick one for Akshat. Akshat, thanks for this. So, would you say that the way AI would be able to approximate actual expertise is a function of the domain, right? So, there are certain domains superstructured, like law is a domain, the law is codified, it's already on the digital layer. So there, it's really a function of how well do you use the AI. But there are other unstructured domains, let's say climate, and how it plays out in marginalized populations. And then even if you optimize your AI use, the gap between what the AI produces as the answer and the real expert who has tangible, intangible knowledge, that's going to be very different. So that was just a quick question for you. And then Astha, my question for you was, clearly this whole black box thing will become even more, so how does one interrogate, how does one negotiate with black boxes if there's one or two design principles there? So say I would appreciate super quick responses to both of those.
Yeah, so to you quickly say that I think it's mostly dependent on the kind of exposure. I understand law is a little easier because there are codes that are easily scrapable and there are judgments which are basically it's a job within the box of judgments and codes, so it's not that tough. But I feel apart from maybe critical studies, where it depends on what the model is being trained on, right, and the kind of data that feeds in, the kind of exposure it gets, right. And I think that's where the even in other spaces of other subject matters, so long as the exposure is diverse and varied, I feel that it falls in the same. It's analogous to law, because I mean, yeah, disruptive thinking would not be present to be beyond extent that is already there, but it all depends upon what constitutes the training data in my head, at least.
Yeah, thanks, Astha.
On design principles, I think co-design as a principle definitely needs to be something that we have to integrate much more, and how we bring people part of the process of the system so they're not sitting outside it. And then I would say I think the other part of it would be, and there's a lot of work that's done in the design justice frame around co-design, which is, no decisions about us without us kind of stuff. And then I would say, I think red teaming, but in a much more offline kind of way, is also definitely something to integrate.
Thank you. Yeah, back to you.
Yeah, okay. And with that, I would like to thank our really lovely panelists for taking out the time to talk about this today. This was a really enriching and thoughtful conversation, I think, and really helped us understand the like systemic and like the zooming out aspect of understanding how the slop economy functions. So thank you again for taking out the time. We would also soon be launching an open source like digital archive of people's experiences with slop, which we call the Museum of Slop. So in case you or anybody you know have any experiences related to that, like my colleague would just be dropping down a link in the chat. So if you want to contribute to that, please feel free to. And yeah, thank you so much and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Astha.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.